If you're feeling bogged down by the impossible expectations or the noise of new year, new me, take a second to pause. Grow Therapy gives you space to slow down, check in, and start the new year from a more grounded place. Whether it's your first time in therapy or your 50th, Grow makes it easier to find a therapist who fits you, not the other way around. They connect you with thousands of independent licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. And if something comes up, you can cancel up to 24 hours in advance at no cost. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. Whatever challenges you're facing, Grow Therapy is here to help. Grow accepts over 100 insurance plans, including Medicaid in some states. Sessions average about $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0, depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
This is episode 17 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Richard Dutton, author of Shakespeare's Theatre, A History, and Professor Emeritus at Ohio State University. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my new friend, Cassidy Cash.
Monkeys were definitely very popular. They were popular amongst, people who could afford them. Yeah, they were very popular, especially with aristocratic women. And I imagine, Shakespeare, he was with a very sort of bohemian set. So he probably had access to a lot of things that other people might not have. So it's very possible he could have had a monkey. That's the sort of thing he could have had access to.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's play, Two Gentlemen of Verona, one character has a pet dog. The dog's name is Crab. The part in the play itself is very small, but it remains included by Shakespeare, which leads to some interesting questions about animals and their role in Shakespeare's history. He must have included Crab strategically, but why? Animals in history are connected mostly to farming, agriculture, and perhaps displayed by royalty to demonstrate their vast exploits into trade and international travel. However, when it comes to the companion animal, the pet dog or cat, I invited Jennifer Jorm to visit with us today and talk about whether Shakespeare or his contemporaries would have had pets and what the audience reaction would have been to seeing a character like Crab on stage. After all, plague was rampant in Elizabethan England, often being blamed on the dogs and cats as carrier animals for the disease. So how was it that animals could hold such a dual role of beloved family pet alongside dreaded carrier of disease? To help us understand a bit more about this, Jennifer Jorm, who is a PhD student currently studying at the University of Queensland under Donna McKinnon, joins us today to discuss these animals, William Shakespeare, and the role of cats, dogs, and even urban livestock in the city streets and market squares during the time William Shakespeare was living there. Hello, Jennifer. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
Were companion animals popular? Was it something people did in Shakespeare's lifetime?
It's one of those questions. It's hard to say because we don't really have a lot of records about what everyday people did. That's something that we can sort of tell a lot more about further on in the early modern period, but we know that people did have them, and that's people of all sorts of social orders.
In Shakespeare's play, Two Gentlemen of Verona, there's one companion animal, which I love because as far as I know, he's the only one. His name is Crab, and he's a companion animal. And I wondered, would Shakespeare's audience have understood that when they saw it on the stage? Would they recognize the presentation of a companion animal?
Absolutely. And Even if you go back to the Canterbury Tales, there was the Prioress's Tale, which I don't know if you remember that, but she had a lap dog that she was obsessed with. It was it was a point of mockery because she liked the dog better than she liked humans, and so it was a point of criticism. So oftentimes when you heard about companion animals sort of in something like a play, it would often be kind of a joke. It would be something to sort of make fun of like the aristocracy or the upper orders. Does that make sense?
That having a pet would be something that made fun of the aristocracy?
Well, not so much having the pet, but having like treating the animal like, for example, the way we might treat a pet now. So
to have it, which is funny considering Queen Elizabeth today and all of her corgis, you wouldn't think that this would be the ancestry, that it wasn't necessarily something that was done for royalty.
No, I think that people considered, sort of having the leisure time to devote to an animal is something that was just sort of,
the working person wouldn't have time to do this.
But that's not to say that people didn't feel affectionately about like their pets or their animals. So, because you're saying pet, right? And so to me, there's like a very distinct definition of what a pet is. Okay. So you've got the way that we define pet is a pet that just exists solely for the pleasure and companionship of the human being. Right. Right. But what people had, even if people didn't have a pet, they felt a lot of emotions and affections and treated their sort of working animals like pets. So if there's something like a horse or a dog, a hunting dog, or even just a dog that someone kept around for protection, and that's right down to like people living on the streets. They felt very affectionately towards those animals. So technically they wouldn't be a pet as we would consider today, but like, the shepherd's dog, for example, that was his companion, that was his pet. And it was just, the primary purpose of that animal was to be a working animal. So in this context, I don't really consider it a pet.
Right, which makes sense. Yeah, it's a valuable asset that you care about. And so there's an overlap, or I guess even a shortage in the English language of enough words to describe the distinction in love of the pet versus love of an animal that's doing a lot for you. But I can understand the gratitude of a pet that's serving you.
Gentlemen in particular were very fond of their hunting dogs, and much to the irritation of their wives, they would be there at the dinner table and they would live in the house and things like that. But
which makes the presentation of Crab in that play make a whole lot of sense in terms of this kind of thing had a place in Elizabethan society. But I find it really ironic because I think dogs specifically, I mean, you've talked about hunting dogs and then the somewhat rare occasion of a companion dog, but weren't dogs specifically kind of mass murdered in relation to plague?
They were, yeah. And see, I don't know I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the context of Crab. Like, I don't know sort of what he was doing in the play.
I don't think Shakespeare knew fully either. It's a very small part, and it's just a conversation between one guy and Crab. And there's a great big history, but I think the gist of it is he's presented as a companion animal. And so it was ironic to me because theaters were shut down because of plague, and I thought dogs were slaughtered because they were thought to carry plague. And so then for a theater that was so directly impacted by outbreaks of plague to then feature a dog in a compassionate way seemed to raise a lot of questions for me about the role of dogs in society. Would people have seen that as a smart decision or a stupid decision to have a dog living in your house with you?
It's really interesting you bring that up because what I found is there are a lot of things when it comes to animals, pets, especially dogs, that actually just don't fall or don't make any sense. So, for example, dogs were definitely considered harbingers of plague. And that comes from old ideas about, so plague usually hit during the summer. And that's when you would see what was called the dog star in the sky. So that was a particular constellation. And so they associated that with actual dogs. And that was one reason why they thought dogs spread disease. But at the same time, people were quite upset when this rounding up of dogs for slaughter occurred. People would try to hide their pets. So there are a lot of like really contradictory feelings about animals, especially dogs. Yeah, so people were, really attached to their own animals, but they just certainly viewed dogs as not only sort of like a harbinger of disease, but like bites and things like that. So they were quite dangerous, and they were roaming all over London. But
so they were their own kind of plague in a way. At least stray ones were. So there was a distinction societally between a stray dog and something that you would keep as a pet, which we do today. I think we can relate to that.
absolutely, and that was the thing is when those orders went out for sort of the mass slaughtering of animals, it was basically the order read, if your dogs are out and running around, they're going to be killed. If they're inside, you're generally okay.
Well, was this kind of response to the dogs of being, having your companion animals versus your stray animals? Was it stray dogs that participated in the bear baiting? Correct me here if I'm saying this wrong, but I thought the bear baiting format was basically a bear was drug out and put to a fight with dogs to see which one would win, which seems gruesome to me as, from like an animal rights perspective. It's like, how could you treat the animals that way? The bear or the dogs, like this is all kinds of not good. And we're seeing that the tenets of concern for animals existed in Elizabethan society because they would, have the companion dog they worried about and the stray dog that they didn't. But then they go and bear baiting is a fun sport. How do these go together?
More contradiction, and that's what I find so interesting about it. The only sort of, you can read sort of preachers and things like that saying, you shouldn't be doing this. It's an ugly and full ugly sight, one of them said. And part of that was because people felt that the way that humans treated animals, they would eventually treat other humans. So it was less about cruelty to the animal and more about how you were going to turn out, sort of, if you grew up, torturing cats or whatever little kids did, then you will grow up to be cruel to humans. And the other factor was this was going on when people were meant to be in church. So a lot of the protest for that was like, you should be in church right now, not giving, because there were a lot of poor people who were doing it, not wasting your money on these disgusting sites.
On these things. Well, what about cats? Where did they fall in Shakespeare's lifetime? Were they the loved or hated animals of the time period?
It's interesting. They were definitely not like on the whole, because you can't really say, for everything. You can't make sort of a universal statement about this because it was just so different. Everyone had sort of different ideas. But for the most part, they weren't really loved or hated. They were just, most people, and let's say like a middle class or the middling sort or the lower orders would have had one in their house because they caught rats. But these cats weren't like pets as we see them now. We're not going to make videos of them. They're not going to make videos of them.
So again, it was a practical investment of this. If you have the animal, it has to be doing a job.
It's actually really interesting, though, because as you get later on in the early modern period, I've actually got a postcard right here of a picture of a girl sort of affectionately, I'll just show it to you over affectionately holding a cat. And so this was the 1800s.
And what's the date on that photo?
So this would have been actually no, it's a bit earlier. It would have been between 1689 and 1760. So it was a bit later that I think people felt. I can't really say it's later that people felt more comfortable displaying affection towards their animals or cats and things like that. It's just that it was more shown. So artwork displaying families with their dogs or, their pets.
The fashion of pets in family life evolved after Shakespeare into something that was more public of their affection. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if that's because it became more acceptable or it was just the medium that was sort of being used to sort of show this all.
Well, I know that exploration was a big deal in early modern England. Elizabeth was sending ships over and bringing back all kinds of things. And some of the things that they would bring back were animals from other countries and even other continents where they traveled. There have been archaeological discoveries of animals like monkeys found in London before and after Shakespeare's time there. So I wonder what kinds of exotic animals would have been seen in London. If we were walking with William Shakespeare down the street of London, what sorts of animals would appear in some of the market stalls there for sale or even on display at court, maybe?
Well, if you're talking about just sort of in the market stalls, you're going to find less of that. Sort of monkeys were definitely very popular, but I think that what was more accessible for people sort of walking the streets, we're talking, people who didn't have as much money or, access to that sort of thing, would have been birds. Birds
like parrots? Or like canaries, or yes to all of them?
I'm not sure about the specific birds at that time.
But pet birds were a popular thing.
Yeah, I mean, because anybody could afford to keep them, basically. And so there are examples of people who were quite poor and not giving up their birds and things like that, even though poor law sort of indicated that if you had an animal or a pet, that you had to get rid of that pet before you would actually receive, money.
Oh, fascinating. Now, you breezed past this, but you said that monkeys were very popular?
Well, they were popular amongst, people who could afford them. Yeah, they were very popular, especially with aristocratic women. And I imagine, Shakespeare, he was with a very sort of bohemian set. So he probably had access to a lot of things that other people might not have. So it's very possible he could have had a monkey. That's the sort of thing he could have had access to, because he would have been sort of around these different people who sort of interacted because of, they were bohemian and artists and, theater actors and stuff like that. They would have sort of been more involved with people who would have had access to something like a monkey.
I love the idea of Shakespeare with a monkey. That is a painting waiting to happen right there to show him with
Yeah, I like to think that. I mean, I don't know if there's any proof of it, but it's entirely possible, and it is very interesting to think about.
Just because they were so popular right there where he was living. Well, what about meat? And I think about London as this city, and I also think that they were very urban, and I know that the houses were stacked right one next to the other. And everything was very confined, but they also didn't have something like a grocery store. So any kind of meat that they were eating or food that they were consuming all had to be grown or farmed in a very, livestock kind of way. What did that look like in London? Were there places in London set aside for farm animals that would be turned into food for the residents of London?
Well, you had the sort of early cattle yards in London, in Smithfield. But animals were everywhere. Like farm animals were everywhere on the streets of London. People would have chickens, pigs, there were cows. If you walk the streets of London, there were animals everywhere. And I've actually got a book recommendation if you're interested in that sort of thing. It's called Beastly London, A History of Animals in the City, and it's by Hannah Belton. And she talks about this kind of thing, about how basically animals were just everywhere. There was no escaping them.
Yes. Well, we love our book recommendations around here. So thank you for that. We'll put that in the show notes of today's episode. Absolutely. Well, what about falconry? I know that was a popular sport in Shakespeare's lifetime because it's mentioned a lot in several of his plays. It's a theme in Romeo and Juliet. And there were rumors that William Shakespeare might have been an amateur falconer himself. Now, I haven't checked that rumor out, and I thought I would throw it at you and say, what do you think about that suggestion? Is that something that holds merit in your mind based on what you know about falcons and the sport in London?
I know very little about falconry. I do know that sort of thing would have been the practice of, someone with the leisure and money to actually practice it. But again, when you talk about Shakespeare, you talk about somebody who sort of existed in between these two worlds very easily. So it's entirely possible he could have had a hobby like that, but I can't confirm it for sure.
And he traveled across that line, as you say, he definitely didn't start out in aristocracy, but at the same time, he ends up performing at court and owning the second biggest house in his hometown. So I think he does an interesting transformation. Well, the subject of animals and certainly pets connected with Shakespeare is something worth learning more about. And you mentioned one book that you wanted to recommend, but I wanted to ask you specifically if you had one or two titles that you would consider essential. Make sure you read these if you want to explore this topic further.
Unfortunately, and this is why I'm sort of doing this PhD, is there's just not a lot about it. There's not a lot about the subject in particular. There's an author, Erica Fudge. She wrote one book called Animal, and she writes a lot of books about animals in the Renaissance. But if you're looking for something more about like what would have been, what kind of interactions people had with animals in their daily lives, there's just not a lot of it. The closest thing I can really recommend right now and sort of be certain that it's a good one is Beastly London.
It sounds like a great one. We'll definitely check into that. Are there resources or information that's been essential to you as you're pursuing your PhD? Is there a resource that you're constantly coming back to that you might want to share with us?
I have to think about that.
No, it's okay. it's okay.
Not particularly. I feel like I'm pulling threads from different locations. It's kind of one of those things I'm picking. I'm looking here, I'm looking there. I think art is a really good thing to look at. Literature is really good. These are kinds of things that sometimes when you can't find something directly through archives, you have to kind of look at sort of cultural things more broadly. And so that's what I've always done is I've always just pulled from whatever I could sort of access. So a lot of the things I've been looking at have been like poetry. So you've got William Cowper, I think he would have been 17th century, writing poems about his pets. He had maybe guinea pigs or mice, and he had sort of anthropomorphized them. So they all had like little names and personalities and things like that. So I think if you're interested in animals sort of during this period, you've kind of got to just sort of pick from different types of sources.
Absolutely excellent advice. Thank you very much. So, what's next for you? What are you working on that you're excited about?
Right now, what I'm doing is I'm sort of focusing on going from medieval England up into the 18th century, which is what I'm mostly focused on, trying to figure out where we kind of got the ideas that will eventually turn into the emotions that we have about animals. So what I'm looking at is this idea of the great chain of being, so that certain animals were higher and closer to God than others. So for example, at the top of the chain is God, and at the bottom of the chain would be like minerals and rocks. But then even amongst animals, you had like, for example, a lion, and then you would have, a dog, and so on and so forth. And I think that these are ideas that we actually still have about animals today. So if I were to ask you, for example, what is worse? If let's say I told you this is kind of a harrowing question, then right now you have to kill a dog or you have to kill a mouse. Which one are you going for?
Oh, I would need more information, but probably the mouse. So I'll play this game.
Yeah.
The mouse.
Because you perceive it as having kind of a lower sense of consciousness. But this isn't just an idea that you just got. This is an idea that's been around since, these were Aristotle's ideas. So it's actually
into our cultural consciousness.
Yes, and they're still there. They're absolutely still there. And so that's kind of what I'm working on now, is sort of tracking that throughout the history of thought about animals, and trying to figure out how that affects how we feel about them.
That's fascinating. Well, Jennifer Jorm, PhD student at the University of Queensland, I am very excited to have spoken with you today. This has been an exciting look at animals in Elizabethan England, and I hope one day to be reading your book as an expert on this topic. I know we look forward to hearing from you in the future that you received your PhD successfully. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was very fun.
In today's interview, Jennifer talked about a photograph, which of course I can't show you over the podcast. So I've placed a copy of the picture she's referencing in the show notes for today's episode, and you can find that as well as her book recommendations and more about Jennifer's research at castycash.com/episode 17. That's castycash.com/EP17. To get up close and personal with some of the history you learned about in today's episode, you can travel with That Shakespeare Girl in September 2019. I have partnered with British History Tours to offer the ultimate Shakespeare experience. It's 8 days in London and Stratford, seeing where William Shakespeare worked, lived, and how he built his enduring legacy. We'll see places like the Globe Theatre, and you'll learn all about staging and performance and his life living in London and Stratford. To get all the details and to sign up to be notified when tickets go on general release later this year, visit castycash.com/travel Shakespeare.
Thank Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.